The World War II has an unprecedented list of unprecedented issues related to it. Among them are the post-war trials, which may seem largely underestimated or even forgotten by wide audiences in our time. Seemingly, nothing like that has ever happened, at least at such scale, because historically, in the end of each war, the winner punished the defeated side as he preferred, and there was no need for a trial. The closest possible match for the World War II is definitely the World War I, which ended with a peace treaty that assigned the defeated nations to pay for the damage inflicted, but the warmongers that once started the war were not prosecuted personally. With the next World War, things changed. Roots of trials commenced immediately after the end of the war, thread from 1943, particularly from the Third Moscow Conference between the major allies that took place in October-November 1943 in Moscow. Among its results, preparing the first in-person meeting of the Allies' leaders in Tehran was the Statement on Atrocities, distantly signed by the leaders of Allies. The Statement on Atrocities established mechanisms for prosecuting war crimes committed by the Nazis and their proprietors. The text was written by Winston Churchill himself, and its main idea was that the war criminals were to be judged by the societies that suffered of their atrocities, with high-ranked Nazis whose crimes are not associated with a specific territory judged by Allies together. This became the basis for the following developments. The idea was to motivate Nazis to refrain from cruelties when the end of the war was already in sight, or just to scare them with the perspective of imminent punishment, and it immediately led to the results exactly opposite to what was intended. As in 2 days after the statement was issued, Himmler ordered Aktion Erntefest, Operation Harvest Festival, that took the most lives of Jewish people within 1 day, some 18,000, and the most lives within one massacre, up to some 43,000 in just a few days. The next step towards the post-war trials was London Conference taking place from June 26 to August 8, 1945, which resulted in signing the London Agreement and Charter, also called the Nuremberg Charter, laying foundation for the following Nuremberg trials according to the guidelines of the Statement on Atrocities. The Charter established an International Military Tribunal, IMT, in Nuremberg, Germany, to try major German war criminals. It assigned the IMT jurisdiction over crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, which include such crimes as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, or persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds. The aggressive war has finally been called a crime. The first Nuremberg trial against the most high-ranked Nazis was followed by 12 other trials against Nazi doctors, judges, commanders, state executives, industrialists, and other entities identified as Nazi accomplices. These were all held before the US military courts, not before the International Military Tribunal, but took place in the same rooms at the same Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. The 12 US trials were collectively known as the subsequent Nuremberg trials, or more formally as the Trials of War Criminals before the Nuremberg Military Tribunals, NMT. The Nuremberg process initiated 3,887 cases, of which about 3,400 were dropped. 489 cases went to trial involving 1,672 defendants. 1,416 of them were found guilty. Fewer than 200 were executed, and another 279 defendants were sent to life in prison. In fact, by the 1950s, almost all of them had been released. The third trial out of 12 against judges was of particular importance and served as prototype for the prominent and most influential motion picture, Judgment in Nuremberg by Stanley Kramer, premiered in West Berlin in 1961. Along those trials, there were others aimed to prosecute personnel of concentration camps or death camps. This series consists of trials devoted to personnel of each major concentration camp. Bergen-Belsen trial in Lüneburg, 1945. Dachau trials in 1945-1948, Helmnot trials held in Poland and in Germany. These were decided almost 20 years apart in 1945-1965. Mauthausen-Gusen trials in 1946-1947. Auschwitz trial in Krakow, Poland in 1947 against 40 SS staff of the Auschwitz death factory. The Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials were a series of 7 for war crimes against camp officials from Ravensbrück in 1947-1948. Several Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in 1963-1965, Majdanek trials that turned out the longest Nazi war crimes trial in history, spanning over 30 years. Sobibor trial in Hagen, Germany in 1965. Belzec trial before the First Munich District Court in the mid-1960s against 8 SS men of the Belzec extermination camp. After these trials finished, there were more, prosecuting criminals that managed to escape being arrested previously but were later traced and arrested, with the most famous Adolf Eichmann trial held in Jerusalem in 1961. This trial was described in a prominent novel Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt. It is important to understand that the convictions of Nazis violated the fundamental principle of the criminal law, nulla poena sine lege, because they did not violate the law of their own country, most often executing orders of their senior officers and supervisors, which makes these trials also unprecedented, and why it was decided to not use their verdicts as precedents in the future. On December 20, 2022, Irmgard Fürchner, aged 97, was found guilty of complicity in the murders of more than 10,500 people and sentenced to a 2-year suspended jail term. This is thought by many to be one of the last, if not the very last, post-war Nazi trial. At a time when another tyrannical state, Russian Federation, wages aggressive war against its neighbor Ukraine, repeating horrendous war crimes similar to those remembered from the World War II, the experience of the post-war trials of war criminals is likely to regain interest of scholars, lawmakers, and wide audiences. We may expect similar trials this time against Russian elites and their accomplices. And the democratic world would certainly strive to conduct new trial sequence so that it becomes even more teaching for history and humanity.